afternoon, everybody. Welcome to CDE Virtual. I'm delighted to ask Roger Jardine, the chairman of FirstRand, to kick us off tonight. I'm also very pleased to share with you that Roger was unanimously elected by the CDE board as the new chairman of our organization, following the retirement of Laurie Dippenaar after 15 long years of service in March this year. So Roger, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Anne. And welcome to the 7th in a series of webinars that have celebrated CDE's quarter century. Been around quite a while, Anne. CDE was launched in August 1995, and over the past 25 years has produced close to 250 publications and hosted over 250 roundtables, workshops, and seminars. These events and publications have made important contributions to the national dialogue about South Africa's economy, addressing questions about jobs, growth, and development. And FirstRand, as you know, has been an enthusiastic supporter of CDE over many years because of the important role of a think tank like CDE. Think tanks like CDE promote policy changes through independent research, evidence, and advocacy. Tonight, we have people from all over South Africa and from many other countries joining us. Top officials in the Presidency, other government departments, politicians, business, and civil society leaders in South Africa and around the world are with us. We also have quite a few people from the media. This is testimony to the caliber of our speaker tonight and our shared interest in the policy trajectory that will put South Africa on a sustainable growth path. The social and economic fallout of this pandemic, together with the failure to implement meaningful reforms earlier, requires that we now make critical policy choices. These choices must give effect to the urgent changes that are required to reverse our current trajectory as a country. And these choices need to be implemented in a manner that optimizes the role of each social partner. For FirstRand, the pandemic clearly illustrates why public-private partnerships must be at the core of a national policy response to the many burning issues of our time. Given the current state of the economy and government finances, it is important that we rapidly rebuild, and the government cannot and should not do this alone. Now, pleasingly, in the past 2 weeks, we've seen some policy green shoots in this regard. And this discussion with Trevor today comes at a very important time when his immense experience and insights are needed to help us to shape the critical policy choices that we now need to make for the future. Trevor, thank you once again for joining us. The very large audience that we have today indicates the very strong interest in your views on South Africa's next 5 years and how we can work to resolve our political and economic crisis. I will hand over to Anne to introduce you formally and to lead the discussion. Thank you very much once again.
Thanks very much, Roger. I first met Trevor Manuel in the late 1980s, soon after he had been released from detention without trial by the apartheid government. I hadn't met someone quite like him before. I'm not sure what he thought about me, but we had a memorable dinner. Since that time, he has become one of the great success stories of our democracy. As Minister of Finance, he surprised the doubters and some racists in our society and established a world-class reputation. He also built a globally respected Ministry of Finance. He went on to serve in the first Zuma government as the minister in the Presidency, responsible for the National Planning Commission and the production of the National Development Plan. He is now chairman of Old Mutual, among other roles in the private sector, and involved in many other initiatives in South Africa and around the world. Most important of all, he was there when CDE was first launched in 1995 at the old Carlton Hotel. So Trevor, it's a great privilege and a pleasure to welcome you to the CDE at 25 series of conversations tonight.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks to Roger as well. It's a pretty daunting task to ask me to look 5 years hence, given the current milieu is pretty daunting, and one would have to be exceedingly arrogant to take a posture on 5 years hence. I tried to get a sense of what happened on 23rd of June, 2016, and there's an interesting piece that Raymond Suttner wrote and was published in Daily Maverick, where he asks a very important question, whether the 1994 gains are irreversible. And I think it's apposite that we start this discussion at that point. What parts of our democracy are safe? How do we secure them? And what is it we want to take forward? And I think that it's something we have to continually engage with in South Africa. I think that the biggest risk to our democracy is that we relax even for a moment. Now, there's an interesting paradox that presents. On the one hand, I think it's important to recognize that the situation is very bad and know that it can't deteriorate any further. And then along comes the Auditor General's report on local government yesterday. And that deals with a period almost 2 years. The period starts 2 years after Jacob Zuma had left office, or was nudged out of office. And then you ask, well, how do you recover that? It's a fundamentally important moment in history. So that's one side of this. And the other is, you know, about 2 decades ago, we looked at Zimbabwe, where there was this cleavage opening between the elite who had access to all kinds of things that kept them in style, and the poor who were increasingly marginalized and fought their way across the border into South Africa. Well, I want to start at a point where in South Africa, my sense is that we, all of us on this call, regardless of how many there are part of that elite. We seem to do reasonably well, but we are the exception. The reality of where we are is that the poor have no border to cross to get away from life here. They will very much be part of what happens from here. And so the decisions taken over the next period are going to be fundamentally important. Recognizing marginalization and dealing with it, I think, is what shapes the now. And I think that in the conversation with you, Anne, I'm hoping that I can draw attention to the things that must be done now to try and place the country on a trajectory for the future, rather than try and take a looking glass and pretend that I know what will happen 5 years hence. Thank you.
Great. Okay, that sounds a good beginning to the discussion. I want to start with the pandemic. What is your view on South Africa's performance? We were very slow off the mark in acquiring vaccines, and we now are very slowly rolling out the vaccinations. We're doing much worse than many other poorer countries, and we're one of the worst in Africa. What's your view of how we've done in a very difficult situation, and what might you have done differently?
Well, I think that it was very hard to plan for this pandemic. The issue of pandemics has been around. There's been an amazing body of research at a number of universities, but nothing of the scale and depth of the current COVID-19 pandemic. And so when it took the world by storm, and South Africa certainly in about March last year, I think government was reasonably quick off the mark. I don't think that we did particularly, I mean, the lockdowns were pretty intense, but and focused the mind, but I don't think we did particularly well in getting the military and the police to engage. I think that they were ill-equipped, and that showed. And so there was, in true South African style, a bit of resistance to what was going on. And then you look over the period, and there's almost a sense that we've come to relax rather too much. And you're seeing this now in the numbers in the third wave, because the intensity that was there certainly through July, August last year is no longer there, and that, I think, is a big issue. I've been concerned about the poor communication. I mean, the idea that we have all our communication in COVID-19 in English, when that's a minority language in South Africa, is rather disastrous. And the idea that you take 6 epidemiologists and put them on television for 2 hours during prime time with tomes of PowerPoint presentations, speaking to a language where quantitative skills are rather hard to come by, has hardly been, and all of that in techno-babble, has hardly been the way to communicate the dangers of the pandemic. And I think very much it's still an issue of how we can prevent the illness rather than merely treat the illness. On the vaccine, I think it's a rather more complex situation. For the period since April last year, I've worked as part of the AU Envoys Group, and this placed us in very close relationship with the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the COVAX initiative, and I think it gave me a particular vantage point of how this matter was unfolding. And the big issue that has been there right from the start is vaccine nationalism. And we saw that in North America, the 2 countries that make up North America had acquired large quantities of vaccines, and this placed them in a position where they could dole it out. And none of this was seen as a contradiction a few weeks ago when the G7 met. And so that still is an issue. Poor countries have to battle to secure vaccines, and then given the fact that the mRNA methodology of vaccine production is still relatively new, we've seen recent reports of countries that have been dependent on vaccines from Sinopharm and the Sputnik, actually vaccinating large numbers of people, but the vaccines appear to be rather less effective than the Pfizer, the J&J, and so on. And then, of course, on J&J, whereas Aspen were fully set up in Gqeberha to produce the vaccines, the problem arose in Baltimore in the United States rather than in this developing country. So all of these issues shape the vaccine rollout. And I think it's important to recognize that it hasn't gone sailingly. I think that you're correct. The Department of Health seemed somewhat hamstrung in securing the vaccines. I know that all of us who've had a jab speak wonderfully about the quality of care that we had at the facilities, but the overall organization of this, I think, leaves much to be desired. Perhaps in our constitution, the split between national and provincial responsibilities hasn't quite resolved itself. So I think there's a mixed bag. I also want to draw attention to the fact that business wasn't left wanting, and so right from the start, the convening of the Solidarity Fund has been quite tremendous, and the drawing together of business interest in Business for South Africa has also been quite remarkable. It's an ongoing venture, and we've seen the quality of outputs that they've been able to make, not just with in respect of dealing with the pandemic, but also about the recovery program going forward. So these are important issues that we need to take account of as we sit here now in the third wave of this pandemic.
I think I'd add also that, the communication issue you raised at the beginning has been very noticeable to me in its sort of absence, that there hasn't been a massive communication campaign to rural people to poorer people to people who don't have internet in terms of accessing the vaccine. I was at Alexandra Health Clinic the other day, and they had lots of vaccine, fabulous staff, but no one to vaccinate, which is truly startling in the situation. Let me move away from that to economic recovery. This is clearly, I mean, vaccination is the first step to getting South Africa back to economic recovery, but we were not doing very well in the economy before the pandemic. And I want to know your view on the government's economic recovery and reform program as announced in October last year. Do you think a state-centered program, which in many ways is what it is the right approach when the state is so incredibly weak, corrupt, not all of it, but very large parts of it? And how do we get the restoration of private sector confidence again so that people are willing to risk money in this economy? What's your view on that?
And I think the first point to make is that that government cannot find itself with any shortage of good quality advice. You just run through the long list of things. Let me start with the President's Economic Advisory Council. They produced a very competent report in November last year that sets out a series of challenges and opportunities. And my sense of it is that whilst this was around the same time as the recovery and reconstruction plan was tabled in Parliament, it appeared not to pollinate that. I think, as I said earlier, B4SA's work has also been quite outstanding. The detailed work that was done in the course of last year as part of a NEDLAC process really shone the light on what needs to be done. It was very, very detailed, very positive, but I don't think it was adequately reflected in the recovery plan that was tabled in Parliament in October, and that's a deep tragedy. I didn't quite see, to the same extent that Labour had done too much work, but they had something on the table, and of course the trade unions would represent the interests of their members, as they must. But I thought that some synthesis would have been appropriate. There was actually a very detailed piece done by the Thabo Mbeki Foundation in February this year that drew attention to the paucity of detail in the reconstruction recovery plan, and I think that's worrisome. But let's just also go back to something else which is quite important, which you would expect me to talk about, which is the NDP. Because the NDP drew a number of strands of life in South Africa together, and I think every chapter lends itself to a lot more detailed work. Now, interestingly, the Bureau for Economic Research at the University of Stellenbosch, BER, did an interesting exercise which was published earlier this year, where they looked at the performance of each of the chapters in the NDP. And there's actually quite a lot of work that they've done. And what they also did was to provide a heat map by chapter of performance. Now, I think one of the issues that emerges from their work is what they've done in respect of the inclusive rural economy chapter 6 of the NDP. And one of the findings that they make, and I know that there might be some people who participated in this process. I saw Wandile Sihlobo's name on the RSVP list. Wandile was involved in this process. And they found that of the 23.3 million hectares committed to land reform a number of years ago, 67% had been achieved. Now, this is quite remarkable, because if you look at the kind of debates that the country lives through in respect of the amendments to Section 25 of the Constitution, you would not for a moment believe that we've advanced 2/3 of the way to where we want to be. And this is why I think what's important from this entire experience is that evidence be used to inform policy making. Now on the issue of land reform, just a week ago, again, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation put out a statement, which is now in the press, about how the ANC had actually deviated from its mission in respect of understanding land reform and understanding land reform in a non-racial democratic South Africa. So these issues are fundamentally important, but I draw attention to the fact that if you merely track what the BER has done, then I think it helps us to understand what the nature of the challenge is. Why are we putting so much energy into a matter which seems to be well taken care of, that needs to be advanced, in fact, as the same chapter does, by involving both current owners and future owners? Why do we pretend that nothing has happened in this domain?
Well, Trevor, I agree with you. It would be great if we had a much more evidence-based policy debate in the country on many topics, including land reform, where the role of market acquisition is often underplayed, and where a lot of the land that has been given to people or redistributed is often not being used very effectively, and the state sits on an enormous amount of land that it has yet to redistribute. So that the facts and the nature of the discussion are often in contradiction and don't make much sense. But let me turn to a sort of feeling that I think a lot of people on this call and that I know would have, which is that one looks around and the country is, I don't know what words to use anymore, but let's say the country is in crisis in so many fronts, from the massive catastrophic unemployment situation to the failure of the economy to grow before the pandemic and then sort of shrinking by 7% last year, to the state of our hospitals, to the very poor quality of education for people. On every front, one feels a sense of really, really not good enough. And I would argue on the vaccination front as well. But there doesn't seem to be a sense of real urgency in government that matches the scale of the crisis and the sort of terrible situation that we're in so many places, from municipalities, as you mentioned, to other places. Now, I've heard you say in public that you think it is possible for the ANC, the president, the government to move much faster on reform. And that, in fact, if the president were to do that, he would be backed by the ANC because there is no other alternative. Is this correct? Is that your view, or how do you see it? And what is your assessment of the speed with which we are trying to turn the ship around on so many fronts?
And one of the documents I looked at just recently is called Operation Vulindlela, and this is run out of the Presidency and the National Treasury, and it's about accelerating performance. It's a very competent set of documents that touch all the right chords. The worrying feature is that there is resistance even to Operation Vulindlela. And I think the problem is that you're sitting with cabinet not as a collective unit. To me, it seems like you're sitting with a confederation of Tsarisms. And just recently on the embedded generation, you know, when the Minister of Minerals and Energy gets up in Parliament and talks about 10 megawatts, and Operation Vulindlela trying to drive a different agenda, it took too long to get to the 100 megawatts number. But similarly on some of the other issues, it seems like in this confederation, there's competition. One of the issues, for instance, that Operation Vulindlela draws attention to is the need to try and accelerate the return to commuter rail in our cities. But it doesn't seem as though the Department of Transport is focused on what they need to do to get PRASA up and running, to ensure that the infrastructure owned and operated by PRASA is actually protected and secured. There's nowhere where they answer what they pay for security services for, or an article in the Business Day, I think yesterday, which talks about this SAA deal, which seems to ignore the Treasury and all of the functions and responsibilities as articulated in the PFMA. That's not the way to proceed in building what the country needs to build. So I'm saying that the approach is there, but there's a kind of reticence to take this on, and I hope that it's not occasioned by an ANC conference which comes next year, because my thinking on that would be take the right decisions and the backing would be there, and the victories would be secured because there'll be a groundswell of support for the right decisions. You're not going to resolve these matters by trying to manage this in what we used to call smoke-filled rooms. There's got to be a different process that is not focused on transactions, but is actually focused on the centrality of policy and our constitutional values.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Sitting on the outside, I kind of want the president to go to the country to back him in the sort of big decisions he has to make. But let me come to something that you've just hinted at in a way. Can South Africa make progress with so many compromised members of the cabinet, either not able to do their job or swirling allegations about them in terms of corruption or other things? And as you would have told me, people are policy. And you know, you can have great policies, but unless you've got committed leaders wanting to implement that and wrestle through the problems, we're not going to get anywhere. So why can't we move faster in getting competent people into the cabinet? And if we can't or don't, can we make progress if we don't have the right people there?
And I think it's a challenge not just for national government. It resorts across all three. And there's this word that was given to this process in the Constitution of spheres rather than tiers. But I think from the Auditor General's report yesterday, it's clear that national government will have to take responsibility for what happens in the everyday lives of people. The services that they expect, the services that aren't there, the services that aren't rendered by local government. And that's not a bad point to start. And if you merely took the Auditor General's report of yesterday and went to the worst performing municipalities that haven't submitted audited statements in how many years, throw out the mayors, the councillors, the members of the mayoral committee, throw out the senior managers, start again, and the responses are likely to be very different to that. I think that, well, it's not just far-flung rural municipalities like Chris Hani or Alfred Nzo. Should Johannesburg have a mayor like Jeff Mkobo on the strength of his own admissions in the Zondo Commission about a sinking fund? Should we tolerate that, or should we act? I mean, we don't have to wait until you get to the step-aside rule because he's criminally charged. Why shouldn't there be a groundswell of opinion that actually drives bad people out of government? And ditto at national level. And you know, there's this debate that's very topical at the moment about deputy ministers, and I have a view on this matter. Let's just take the fact that Dr. Mkhize has stepped aside voluntarily, seemingly, and you now have a Minister of Tourism taking responsibility for that. Now, there is no impediment to President Ramaphosa actually looking at the situation and acknowledging that in a pandemic, you need a competent health minister who is au fait with the running of health systems, and recognize that in the Deputy Minister of Health, Dr. Pasha, he may have somebody like that, elevate him to the cabinet so that he can be of single-minded focus on the pandemic going forward. If later Dr. Mkhize is in a position to return, it's fine. You can reshuffle cabinet again, but you can't have somebody operating on the one hand, trying to deal with matters of tourism and cooking with Somizi, and on the other hand, trying to have the necessary serious focus of resolving critical elements of the pandemic. It just can't work in the public mind. And so these are decisions that must be taken. They must be taken soon. And I think it's important, but there are also other issues besides trying to deal with people who are in cabinet. You see, and when we worked on the National Development Plan, we devoted a lot of time and attention to what we call building a capable and developmental state. And there are a couple of issues that are front and center of that. The first of those is that you have to stabilize the political administrative interface. And the second is that you must make public service and local government administration careers of choice. And third is that you must develop technical and professional skills. And the fourth is that you must strengthen delegation, accountability, and oversight. Now, let's just deal with the first issue, the political administrative interface. Part of what appears to be wrong at the moment is that ministers are everything. The Minister of Police doesn't need a commissioner of police, it would appear. Ministers have taken over the role of DGs and all of their officials. They decree. And I think that operation by decree weakens the political administrative interface, because what the Public Finance Management Act does is to draw out and distinguish between the responsibilities of accounting officers, the director generals, and confirms that they're responsible for outputs, and then the executive authorities of ministers, and confirms that they're responsible for outcomes. And these have to interact, but you can't have ministers being so powerful that you don't develop competent technical public service skills. And I think it's part of what we're dealing with at the moment. It's been there since 2009, and I think the situation hasn't been arrested in the last 3 and a bit years either.
Trevor, I've heard you talk on a panel about how the cabinet used to operate and the systems of, sort of top officials and then clusters of ministers before anything came before the cabinet, and that this doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Could you say a few words about that?
Well, let's go back to the Constitution, and Section 92 of our Constitution confirms that ministers are, or cabinet members are, collectively and individually responsible. And the highest form of that collective responsibility has to be the budget. And so part of what we had designed was a system of progressive decision-making in the course of an annual cycle. So by the time the Minister of Finance tables a medium-term budget policy statement in October, and certainly by the time he or she would table the budget, it's owned by all of cabinet. And everybody has to be bound by the decisions because they were part of the decision-making process, which is run over the entire year. And so at least when the Minister of Finance gets up to table the budget, he or she should know that cabinet gives it its most, its fullest backing. But that's not what you see. I mean, a minister gets up and talks about the implementation, and this was as recent as this week, talks about the implementation of the basic income grant. If you ask the Minister of Finance at what point he will be able to provide for the basic income grant, he'll probably say, not within the next 5 years on present estimates. it's not that he doesn't believe in the basic income grant, it's that it's not affordable in the current milieu. And if you want it, you have to give up something else. And that is the system of trade-offs that has to operate in the cabinet room. And in the absence of that, it's unbelievably difficult to understand how the system can work, because that's where the trade-offs happen. Similarly, in terms of functions, the so-called MINMECs, that's ministers with MECs, must actually deal with a series of issues. I don't believe that the system operates any longer, where ministers, MECs, senior officials would sit on a regular basis, and if education is your beat and they've got a fancy title, the Council of Education Ministers it's called, they need to look at every aspect of education. The health ministers, the transport, all of the functions must actually operate on that basis. And this is cabinet writ large, but I don't have a sense that that is operating at the moment. And so it's a group of individuals. It's a confederation I spoke of earlier. And it will be the undermining of the quality of governance. And then, of course, the check for all of this is Parliament or the provincial legislature, and that doesn't work either. And the idea that at provincial and local government level, you have discrete executive and legislatures is a pipe dream that won't work in our lifetimes. So we have to look at those issues and ask how we can improve on the quality of decision-making and the accountability for the decisions that are made.
So what's your view on an issue in which I think some people in the ANC seems divided on this issue from what I can gather, but what's your view on cadre deployment? And, you know, the NDP talked of professionalizing the state, and I presume that's sort of people fit for purpose, but how do you see cadre deployment? Has it exhausted its possibilities, or where are you on this debate?
Look, let me be clear that political office bearers must have the backing of the political parties. Doesn't matter which party you're in. If you have governance responsibilities, you must have the backing for your political office bearers. But in the same way as when you have, and let me just parallel from the Companies Act, once a board is appointed, the board must act in the interest of the company. Part of acting, and the company is not just shareholders, but all its stakeholders. And I think that that has been very well canvassed, and recent work by Mervyn King confirms exactly the operations of that. And I think government must be exactly the same. So take strange places for Cadre deployment. If you look at the operations of large state-owned enterprises, and take one that's very topical, Eskom. Eskom has its own legislation, and its operations as a company are governed by the Companies Act. So the board must have oversight, and part of the oversight of the board has to be the appointment of executives. And then there's a minister, and the minister comes in, and I hope that the minister respects the presence and position of the board and doesn't kind of leapfrog over them, but the minister should have no role beyond what the board does. And then you have accountability to Parliament, and if you are the CEO of Eskom, you might be called to the portfolio committee on public enterprises. You might be called to the portfolio committee on minerals and energy. You might be called by Scopa, and you're likely to be called there as well. So we haven't clarified exactly how this works. And then you have in the African National Congress a committee chaired by the Deputy President, supported administratively by the Deputy Secretary General, deciding who should serve on boards even of regulators. It's a completely bizarre thing. And unless the ANC realizes that the system has let us down very badly, unless you can trust a minister appointed to check in cabinet and be able to appoint senior officials like DGs, deputy DGs, and so on, and let them get on with the business of running the department, the system can never work. You can't have an outside agency determining on the basis of, I don't know what facts they take into account, who should be placed where. But the system has failed and is continuing to fail and will fail the African National Congress unless it is arrested immediately.
Well, that's clear on your position. Thank you. Let me ask you a question that I think is very hard and I wrestle with, and I think it's a big challenge for the society. On the one hand, we know the state has been undermined and corrupted, as you've been talking about, not in every part, but it's really weak. On the other hand, we need a state to implement reform and to help get South Africa going again and get the economy going again. So we sit in this conundrum. What do we do without an effective state? And so my question to you is not the longer term, we have to rebuild it in a professional way, but it's what do we do now when we have very immediate tasks and we don't have the right people often in the cabinet or DGs or whatever, or the provinces or the metros or elsewhere. What do we do now? What could the president or the governing party do now in a context where we really have an extraordinarily weak state?
There are a couple of issues that present. I think the first of these, and the president has spoken to it, but it needs a big push, and that is to bring back the idea of a social compact. I think that parts of it were tested. I said that when NEDLAC looked at the Reconstruction Recovery Plan, the shell was there, but the detail needs to be worked out. And the devil is in the detail. And that is something that South Africans must commit to, a social compact. It was the essence of what we did in what we crafted in the National Development Plan. And there's a wonderful book written by Manoush Shafiq, just recently published, on what we owe each other. And in a society like ours, I think we owe each other the responsibility to know that nobody goes hungry, that we will do our level best to ensure that there's employment and that everybody can aspire to a reasonable quality of life. What will get us there? That's the first issue. That should focus the mind of government. And there are going to be things that slip through the cracks. But if the president and his cabinet talk about it all the time and do little things to inform it, you're going to drive the change. So that's the first issue. The second issue that I think is fundamentally important now is to fix public finances. This was drawn, and I think the attention of the president was drawn to this by the work undertaken by, amongst others, the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. It's pretty detailed work. And so how will you repair this? At the moment, there's debate around what the fiscal ceiling should be. We are extensively borrowed. How do we ensure that there's a plan going forward that will return our public finances to good health? The third issue is the issue of capability. And here, I think that amongst the issues we need to look at is the costs of the public service. And I am not the finance minister, and I know that he's taken on a big battle with this. But, you know, I came across some stats just recently. The Minister of Health, now on leave of absence, Willem Kiezer, spoke recently about 1.2 million health workers, in the 1.25 million health workers in the system. And there was a fact check of this, and the number across public and private sector appears to be just under 604,000. Now, how can the minister be that wrong? How can he be undercounting health workers by 1 in 2? there's something fundamentally wrong. Might it be that there are too many people employed in departments of health that have nothing to do with health? We've seen this at the Tuli House recently. Might it be that the structure is all wrong? And given the fact that the Minister of Finance was talking about the fact that 95% of public servants earn more than the bottom 50% of registered taxpayers, there's something wrong in the system. This has to be right at the front of what needs to be remedied, failing which you're not going to be able to produce quality services. The next issues are local government. The SOEs are an utter and complete mess. And then I think we need policy certainty. Those are the issues that I think should be raised up the agenda, and we need to come back to them. We mustn't tire or become tired of talking about these issues and knowing that there are proper decisions made to remedy those kinds of matters.
Trevor, let me turn now to some other issues, the ANC amongst others. You were the first person who publicly said that in 2011, you knew about the Guptas and Fikile Mbalula and the story that's now been told to the Zondo Commission. If you look back on the horrors of what happened over the last decade, do you have any regrets about this? Do you have any, was there more you might have been able to do or anybody else at the time and in the period after 2011 when it became clear that the Guptas were essentially, I don't know, running the cabinet or parts of the cabinet?
You know, my experience, and it's a very limited experience of what happens in cabinet, reflects on the fact that there are so many things that you don't know about. And I go back to section 52 or 92, collective and individual responsibility. You don't actually know what happens in a line function. So all that cabinet does is to look at memoranda in front of it that are brought there for decision making. So whilst I was there, if there was an issue in the Defense Force, I wouldn't necessarily know about it unless it were brought to my attention. And I think it's the same kind of issue. And so, you know, we picked up some issues, and the matter that you refer to relating to Fikile Mbalula being told that he would become the Minister of Sport from being the Deputy Minister of Police. He'd raised very tearfully in a meeting of the African National Congress. Now, I was not involved, and you know, nothing was asked of me by President Zuma or anybody else in relation to the Guptas. I wasn't asked to provide resources for their breakfast, lunch, or suppers. I wasn't asked to place advertising in their so-called newspapers. I wasn't asked to meet with them. And perhaps I was so unpopular that life was just going to be like that. So I have no regrets about being unpopular on the Guptas, but how these issues happened, and you look at this now being reflected in the Zondo Commission, and my hope is that the Deputy Chief Justice will complete this body of work soon. And I know that he's had to ask for an extension just recently, but I also hope that you can take action, because it seems as though the National Prosecutorial Authority is somewhat under difficulties, and so prosecutions are happening rather too slowly. But I think with the release of the Zondo Commission, you actually have to go, and if it's through the strengthening of the SIU or some other body, go after this thing. I mean, you know, we could have a lovely jumble sale, 200 suits here and cars there and so on. I think that we have to close out the opportunities that people have had to amass wealth by illegal means, and that becomes quite important for us. I think that as I called out what's happening in local government, once there are consequences for actions, I think you then begin to change the behavior of people. If we leave those matters unattended to, there's no reason for people to be well-behaved because nothing happens to them whether they're well-behaved or as badly behaved as they've been for a long time. We have to take action much sooner. And, there's a former MEC for Health in Gauteng who a decade ago was getting up to all kinds of strange things. I see that he will now be prosecuted. I'm very glad about that. But I think since then, the Gauteng Department of Health has been in a mess because these things are actually very difficult to recover from because these are not individuals. They take officials in departments who otherwise would be competent. They take them into this layer with them because they can't do it alone. And so you've got to deal with these issues fully and frontally.
I want to probe a little bit more here. With hindsight, watching the Zondo Commission, you see all sorts of things unfolding about the corruption and what was going on. And it's so that's with hindsight. Let me ask the question this way. If people of integrity in the ANC or the cabinet had spoken out earlier and more publicly about what they saw was going on, was that possible? Was that even did one know enough to speak out? It's puzzling to me, and it's a real question. It's not a trick question. I don't know. I'm asking.
Look, take the Zondo Commission, and I appeared before the Zondo Commission fairly early in the process. And I did it because I fervently believe in the work that the Zondo Commission has to do. And as I explained to the judge and the investigating team, I wish I had stuff to tell them that was much more than what I did. I didn't hide anything, but I didn't have a hell of a lot to tell them because I couldn't go there with hearsay evidence. And so what is it that you need? You need people who were actually involved in decision-making, and you've seen that not only from whistleblowers, but you've seen the unraveling of people's confidence by going into this, and the big chunks of money that seem to have been transferred corruptly were out of the large SOEs, Eskom and Transnet, and those strange bodies like Homix that were set up to launder the money. And so you could be in government, you could, be there and not know that those things are happening in a state-owned enterprise. And it's that kind of difficulty. And it's not just what you read in the newspaper. It is actually about having personal knowledge that you can attest to in a commission and speak up about these issues. It does make it rather difficult. At what point? I mean, sure. I think mutually by 2009, I wasn't going to return as Minister of Finance. I didn't want to return as Minister of Finance. Big debate, big moral debate. Should I go in? Because nobody quite knew what would happen during the Jacob Zuma term. And I think the second term was much, much worse than the first term. And so should I have gone in at all and undertaken the responsibility to chair the National Planning Commission was a question that I grappled with and then opted to try and do it. I didn't have to do it. I didn't, just bear in mind that in 2012, I stepped out of the National Executive Committee of the ANC. It was a voluntary decision. And 2 years later from the executive. Between those two dates, you may recall that the then Secretary General, currently the chairperson of the ANC, had declared me a free agent. I don't know what that means in practice in a membership-based organization, but there were clearly battles about a range of issues that resulted in that declaration of me being a free agent.
Do you think the ANC can be fixed? People talk of it now as a gang of marauding thieves. Can it be fixed, and can it be fixed quickly enough as a government? So
as one who kind of grew up in resistance politics that kind of morphed into an ANC position, the thing that worries me about South Africa, and I think it might be so in various parts of the world, is what is left of party politics. Okay, let's step out of South Africa for a moment, and ask the question whether the grand old party, the Republican Party in the United States, is redeemable. My sense is it's not. I mean, how can 70 million people be so caught up with Donald Trump and fail to understand what the traditions of the Republican Party are? I mean, is the UK substantially different? Is the party of Boris Johnson the party of many of the leaders who've been there before? Is Labour the same? In South Africa, I mean, which party are you going to look at? I mean, if it's not the ANC, would you look at the DA with any seriousness, a commitment to democracy and non-racialism? I don't think so. Could you take the fascist EFF and begin to align yourself with their policies? I think not. Has the IFP recovered from the way in which it was seen once? I think not. And ditto, the ANC was once a very strong party. I referred to the fact that the Thabo Mbeki Foundation spoke about traditions of the ANC, spoke about tribal traditions within the ANC, spoke about the risk of going back to before 1913 Land Act and entrenching tribalism in South Africa again. All of these things are part of the quagmire. You've got to reconstruct with a continuity of policymaking, because non-racialism didn't arrive on the 27th of April, 1994. There was a groundswell of non-racialism. Go back to 1955, the Freedom Charter. Look at the split of the PAC. Look at various splits. There was a groundswell of commitment to a set of values that evolved, and I think there's been a massive rupture now. So does the solution lie in political parties? I think not. I think that we, like we were amongst the first countries in the world to do a peaceful transition in the nature of the transition that we had, perhaps we need to apply our best minds to a situation that asks how you resolve matters so that you have you can live out those commitments in our constitution, and they're articulated very clearly from the preamble right through clearly the Bill of Rights as well. Ask how you deliver on that, and ask whether it has to be about political parties or whether we can do these things differently. I don't know what the answers are, Anne, and I don't know how you construct accountability, but I have a sense that the proposals now arising from the Constitutional Court decision on the right of individuals to elect and also be elected, and the proposals that committee reporting to the Minister of Home Affairs, which is chaired by Mohamed Vali Musa, is looking at to change the electoral system, might be the beginning of something that we seriously have to take account of. It hasn't provided all the answers for us, given the hybrid between proportional representation and constituency-based systems in local government. But we have to use the moment now to rethink some of the issues. And I spoke about the notion of spheres and so on as well. There are a number of aspects of our constitution that we have to rethink in the operations, and know that it's not just taking a decision and standing back. but we need to strengthen the lines of accountability, and Parliament can't deliver the accountability that a democracy like ours needs.
Well, that's a very interesting note on which to close. There are lots of issues I would like to pick up with you, but we have reached the end of our hour, and I do want to hold to my promise to only keep you for an hour. Trevor, thank you very much for being so frank with us, for a fantastic discussion on some very tough and difficult issues facing the country, the ANC, and all of us. So thank you very much indeed. And thanks to the audience. Thanks for joining us tonight. This webinar is now closed. Trevor, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you and CDE, Ann.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.